Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Global tensions are intensifying as Donald Trump questions America's commitment to NATO while pursuing a controversial war in Iran, raising fresh concerns for Ukraine and European security. Joining us is Wierenga. He's a lecturer in international relations at the Baltic Defence College to unpack the latest developments and their wider implications. Louis, welcome back to TVP World. Thank you, as always, for taking the time.
Always great to be with you.
Thank you. So, Donald Trump's never been a great fan of NATO's, has he? He's always said, that America's paying way too much, taking too much of the burden. He's called NATO a paper tiger in the past. But this time, his words, about leaving NATO seem a little bit more serious. What do you think?
I think it's just the ire of the president due to European members' refusal to send ships to help unblock the Strait of Hormuz. You might say that if something bigger in play, his request for assistance could be read as just a test to see who would send and who would not, whether or not he actually wanted them or desired them. That part is actually unclear. But I want to say a couple words about that, about the whole withdrawal from NATO. I don't think that that's going to happen. I think that what is more pressing as a potential leverage point would be the U.S. not reaffirming their commitment to the collective defense of NATO, because the remarks that you mentioned, where he called NATO a paper tiger and said that he was absolutely considering withdrawing, came just a couple of hours after Defense Secretary Hegseth declined to reaffirm America's commitment to collective defense, not saying that they wouldn't. He just declined to reconfirm. But I'll just say a couple words about that, is that if they were to try and initiate this process, the U.S. Constitution specifies that the president has the power to make treaties, but that's only making treaties. And they also need 2/3 of the 100-member Senate to concur with that. And his own Secretary of State, who is also dual-headed as the National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio, co-authored a bill with Democratic Senator Tim Kaine in 2023, which Congress passed and President Biden signed into law, which will bar any U.S. president from suspending, terminating, denouncing, or withdrawing the U.S. from the Washington Treaty unless they have 2/3 majority in the 100-member Senate. But it also says that no U.S. funds can be spent on a withdrawal from NATO. But there's some other legal issues that come in there. And again, I don't think it'll happen, but I think it's important to say that there's a lot of support in Washington for NATO, that it's bipartisan. And just today, U.S. Democratic Senator Gene Sheehan and Republican Senator Tom Tillis, who are both on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and they co-chair the Senate NATO Observer Group, issued a very strong pro-NATO statement about their support for NATO. So I think what would be the worrisome thing is just for the duration of this administration, if the U.S. decides just not to renew their commitment rather than withdraw. But I'm not even sure that that's...
Understood. Now, Trump was complaining that the Europeans didn't pull their weight, not only about the Straits of Hormuz, but also about the fact that they wouldn't let U.S. planes land in the UK or France or Spain. In fact, Spain even blocked Spanish airspace to United States Air Force planes. Now, that is something that could have been done without those countries being, quote, dragged in to this attack on Iran.
Yes, indeed. It wasn't just Spain. Italy refused to allow U.S. military aircraft to land at one of their bases in Sicily. The United Kingdom restricted the use of their bases for defensive action. This is something that I think is going to potentially create add to the tension, let's say. I mean, prior to the war in Iran, of course, it was defense spending, and that was the big issue. Well, that was solved in large part because of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and the uncertainty of the security environment. But I think that what's happening right now, I mean, there is, as I mentioned, a strong contingent that's bipartisan in Washington that's very, very supportive and pro-NATO. The current president, of course, is not pleased with them right now, but I want to make 2 points on this. The first thing is that is not a NATO issue. That is a bilateral issue between Spain and the United States, the United Kingdom and the United States, Italy and the United States. These countries just happen to be in NATO. The U.S. did not actually use the North Atlantic Council to try and have this be a NATO mission. And of course, the big reason behind the countries that we mentioned not allowing the U.S. to use their bases or airspace is because they don't support the war, because they weren't consulted when the United States and Israel decided to launch strikes on Iran. But, some people have made the argument that there should be a little bit more cautious political engagement because the last thing that anybody wants to have happen is that the U.S. president says, well, guess what? Your conflict with Russia is not our conflict with them because our issues with Iran weren't your issues. And I'm sure that that's being sorted out diplomatically, but I think it's also important to note that there are some more serious than in any time recently, more serious as any time since 2022, discussions with European leaders about the future of European security. They met in Helsinki. 10 European leaders met for a private dinner. It was just them, no aides, no officials. And they had a frank discussion about the state of the transatlantic alliance. And, this is actually you look at the UK and Poland, for example, they were very quick to join the United States in 2003. And this time they said they're not going to be a part of it. So what those discussions will lead to could maybe be this coalition this multilateral coalition of middle powers that are addressing Europe's security concerns first and foremost, because this is not deemed to be a direct concern for European security.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk about the two wars currently going on, starting with Iran. What are President Trump's war aims? Have they been achieved? And when is the U.S. pulling out?
I mean, that's a great question. I don't think that anybody really actually knows what those war aims are. So he said that the U.S. has destroyed Iran's Navy and most of their Air Force, that they've crippled the ballistic missile and nuclear programs, and that they would, continue to hit Iran extremely hard over the next 2 or 3 weeks. But despite having made those claims, the Iranians have showed that their remaining missiles and drones can still be used to target Israel, as well as America's Gulf allies and even U.S. military installations that are in the region. And he said regime change was the goal, but it's not actually the goal. He said it wasn't the goal. There's another Ayatollah who's probably safely secured in a bunker and will, because he's anticipating a potential assassination. Who knows?
Well, maybe he's already dead.
But that's the thing. And then Trump said that the U.S. would achieve all of their military objectives shortly. But he's also saying that the Iranians want to negotiate. And so he seems to think that they want to talk, but that if a deal isn't made, then they're going to continue to hit key targets. He said in his speech, that they would hit electric generating plants. They haven't hit oil yet. That is not off the table. And so we also don't even know what the objective is for the Strait of Hormuz, because he basically told allies and partners, if you want it, you go and deal with it. So what is the objective? Not sure. But it's also not certain that it really will be 2 and 3 weeks until the U.S. leaves. Now, my read on that is basically that he was addressing the American people, because I believe his approval rating has dipped down to around 36%. And I think he's trying to find the a way of getting an off-ramp without tilting his strategic hand. He's pretty good at that. So it keeps everybody guessing, but also allies and partners, not just the Iranians.
Well, clearly his popularity rating is going to be reflected in some way in the midterm elections coming up in November. So that's, I suppose, also part of his thinking pattern on this. Now, at the same, there are two things you said there that I want to pick up on. The first is negotiations. Now, yes, the top leaders, as they were, have been eliminated. But do we know who's now in charge in terms of the IRGC, in terms of the theocratic leadership, and therefore who would be involved in these negotiations?
That is not quite clear. I think that the IRGC likely has the upper hand, but the president of Iran said that the regime would consider ending the war if it received security guarantees. And that was said as more U.S. troops arrived in the Gulf region and as Iran continued its attacks on Israel and across the Gulf. And also the Houthis in Yemen launched their first strike against Israel recently since the start of the war. So, there's talk about talking, and then there's action that indicates that that's not going to happen. I think that we may see actually the IRGC pick up the upper hand in the clerics versus the IRGC, because right now, of course, there's a war going on. And it's likely that proxy attacks are going to continue much more severely. But I think that the U.S. I'm always cautious making predictions. I don't think that they're going to put boots on the ground yet, for example, to take Karg Island. But, there's 2 deployments of U.S. Marines. The 82nd Airborne has gone into the region. But I think that that's just there as to reinforce their force posture.
Right. OK. And just very briefly, if you would, Louis, Ukraine, what do you think is going to happen there? Will President Trump continue to sell weaponry and intelligence to Ukraine, or do you think he'll say, well, Europe, it's in your backyard, you deal with it?
I think either's possible. I would say that Ukraine is not first and foremost on the president's agenda right now. I mean, this is, and as you also mentioned, the midterms are going on. There's a couple issues about Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine that are, I think, quite critical right now, because since the Strait of Hormuz was closed, Russia got a premium on their oil supply, and there was a 30-day suspension relief from U.S. sanctions that was meant to sort of mitigate and lessen the blow of the global energy crisis. And that's allowed the Kremlin to rake in millions of dollars, much more so than usual on oil sales. So basically, all of this revenue is pouring into their war coffers. And U.S. weapons are prioritized for the war in Iran instead of arming Ukraine. So there's a big gap in lethal aid. And then the last point that I want to make is that just in talks of figures, once the Strait of Hormuz was closed, when energy prices ramped up, Russian crude went from $57 to 115 in the span of a month. Now, there is a silver lining on that, because I think that President Zelensky is doing a lot of diplomatic heavy lifting in the Gulf region, visiting Jordan recently, offering to help with drone technology, and European leaders are certainly continuing to rally around President Zelensky and Ukraine. So if it is the fact that the United States is focused on this first and foremost, but I'll also reiterate the same for Ukraine, the point that I made earlier about NATO, is there is bipartisan support from a lot of folks in the U.S. Congress and Senate that would want to see more support go to Ukraine. So that could be some changes in the next midterm elections.
Right, we shall wait and see. Louis Wierenga, as always, thank you so much for sharing your analysis with our audience, and have a good evening.
Thank you. You as well. It's my pleasure.
Bye now. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.